Would be three things. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
How much did you pay for
All right, that was a very long press conference that President Trump just held 1 year into his second term in the White House. Almost 2 hours, I think it was, almost 2 hours. And he kept coming back to the topic of immigration, but he was covering a lot of different things in his characteristic weave. Although this was sort of a moment that I think stood out. He ended a little bit more energetically, but certainly the beginning where he was not taking questions, not so much.
No, it was, and we noticed it right away. It was very low energy in the beginning, sort of reading, sort of doing a weave, but it almost seemed at some points he was going back to things that he had already addressed, reading them off of the book that he brought out with him. Not clear if he didn't remember that he had talked about them already or if he wanted to go back to them. There is also, over the last nearly 2 hours, as you point out, there's a lot that we need to fact check here because there was a lot of what the president said that was not true. Daniel Dale is joining us for some of that. Daniel, as you've noted for us over the last couple of hours, some of these are things that we have heard from the president a number of times, certainly over the last year. What are the points that he continued to hammer home that are inaccurate? I mean, we picked up on gas prices, a little fudgy there, the price of goods, inflation. Walk us through.
There are just so many. I'm struggling to keep track of it. 18 trillion in investment in the U.S. That's a fictional figure. 600% reduction in prescription drug prices. That's a fictional figure. I ended 8 unendable wars. 8 is a fictional figure. We inherited inflation at a historic high. No, he inherited 3% inflation, just a little bit above where it is now, although it did hit about a 40-year high in June 2022, more than 2 years before he returned to office. He said many of the groceries have come way down. Yeah, there are some particular grocery products that have gotten cheaper during his presidency, but on the whole, grocery prices have increased. And in fact, December's inflation report showed that the biggest 1 month jump in grocery prices in 3 years occurred between November and December. And he just veered into so many inaccurate tangents. He repeated this claim that the Los Angeles wildfires of early 2025 were supposedly caused by the state trying to use some of its water to protect small fish species. Experts in California water policy have repeatedly explained those two things simply have nothing to do with each other. That's imaginary. He said things like, I think NPR and PBS have closed down. They haven't. You can check for yourself, not to tell you to go to another station, but they're still on the air. So just claim after claim. I think we've addressed like 15 plus over my 3 fact check hits so far this afternoon. I could go on and on, but just a litany of lies, many of them debunked months or years ago by myself and others.
Yeah, and thank you for taking us through that. Let's go back to the White House where Kristen Holmes is. You were there for the entirety of this appearance by the president. I wonder if you could give us your takeaways, Kristen, but also if you could address one of the last questions he kind of didn't answer, actually. He was asked if he was committed to keeping the U.S. in NATO. He talked about having a good relationship. He doesn't agree with a lot of the things they've done, but that it predates him. And he said NATO, whether you like it or not, is only as good as we, the U.S., are. He meant if they don't have us, they're not very strong. What did you think of his answer, and what is your reporting on where he stands on NATO, considering he's threatening tariffs over Greenland?
Look, this is something that we have been talking to officials around President Trump about for the last several weeks, particularly in the last 24 hours, since he has really ramped up his rhetoric on our European allies and on NATO. And when you talk to these allies and these administration officials, they say that the president is not going to do anything to breach NATO, that he is still committed to NATO. And he said so in a very roundabout way earlier in this briefing. He said that his problem with NATO was that the United States, would always come to the rescue of NATO, but he wasn't sure if NATO would come to the rescue of the United States if they needed it. So they're kind of affirming that he would still support or did still support NATO, but obviously still airing grievances. You ask what the takeaways were from the last over an hour of President Trump up here, and it was that he had a lot of grievances that he wanted to air over the last year. He clearly is frustrated at several times. He said that he didn't think his people were getting getting the message across. He complained about his public relations. He said the reason that he was out here talking about this is because people didn't seem to be really getting a read on what he was doing for his agenda, and that he had to come out here and talk about it. It was frustration in the sense that he knows and has seen all the polling. One of the things that we've obviously reported on this week, President Trump and his team have looked at all of the polling that we have been showing for the last several days, showing just how dissatisfied Americans are, particularly when it comes to the economy. And they are aware of that. President Trump himself is aware of that. So there's frustration as he was trying to get a point across points on what he believes his administration is doing for the economy. There was a lot of blame going around, a lot of blaming of former President Joe Biden, a lot of attacks on the former president, which was, I mean, just think of where we are right now. We are now in the second year of the second term of President Trump, and he is still blaming Joe Biden and saying that he didn't win in the election back in 2020. So clearly, I mean, this was a real airing of grievances for the last over an hour, as he seems frustrated internally as well that his own people are not getting the message across that he believes should be sent out there.
Yeah, and just to note, as he says that NATO wouldn't come to the rescue of the U.S., the only time the collective defense clause of NATO has been invoked was after 9/11. When NATO allies did come to the defense of the U.S. And just to point out, Denmark actually per capita, not in total, but per capita suffered greater losses in Afghanistan than any other NATO ally. Of course, Greenland, a territory of Denmark. Just something to point out that's gotten a lot of notice there, certainly from Danes here in the last few days.
It absolutely has. And Nick Robertson is standing by in Greenland. Nick, as we were just talking about with Kristen, the president was asked directly about NATO. He dodged on that question, didn't answer it, talked about everything the U.S. has done for NATO. He was also asked directly whether the price he's willing to pay to get Greenland was the breakup of NATO, and he didn't answer that either. How is this sitting with the people in Greenland in this moment?